Why did a wave of molasses moving 35 miles an hour kill 21 people in the streets of Boston? And the city just kept going? Welcome to 71 Dumbest Things About Boston that only make sense after a Dunkin, where we're digging up true stories crazier than fiction. Like the real reason Paul Revere never actually shouted, "The British are coming." Or the Boston hotel that accidentally invented a cake everyone still calls a pie. We're separating real history from total myth, one absurd fact at a time. So hit subscribe, because point number 47 is going to break your brain. 1. Christmas was illegal in Massachusetts for over 20 years, and Boston Puritans treated Santa like a wanted criminal. Starting in 1659, anyone caught celebrating Christmas paid a 5-shilling fine, which was a hefty sum back then. Puritan leaders saw the holiday as a rowdy pagan excuse for drinking, and mischief unwelcome in their strict colony. Neighbors snitched on each other for humming carols or hanging greenery indoors. Families celebrated secretly like it was a covert operation. The ban finally lifted in 1681, letting Boston welcome Christmas back through the front door. 2. On a cold December night in 1773, a group of Boston rebels dressed as Mohawk warriors before boarding 3 British ships. They dumped 342 chests of tea straight into the harbor, protesting a tax they never agreed to pay. The disguise was not about respect, it was about avoiding recognition and a hanging for treason. Locals watched from the docks as tea leaves piled along the shore for weeks afterward. The costumes fooled almost nobody, but they worked well enough to help spark a revolution against Britain. 3. Fenway Park has been hosting baseball since 1912, and it is still the oldest ballpark running in the entire Major League. Builders never expected it to survive a century, let alone become a shrine. The Green Monster Wall was not designed for glory. It was built to stop cheapskates from watching games for free on nearby rooftops. Generations of fans crammed into narrow seats built for smaller bodies decades ago. Somehow, the cramped charm only made people love it more. Boston refused to tear it down and turned an old stubborn stadium into baseball royalty. 4. Boston's streets twist and turn like a maze because they were never planned by engineers. They were shaped by wandering cows. Colonial cattle roamed freely searching for grass, and their hoofprints eventually became walking paths. Those paths later hardened into roads without anyone bothering to straighten them out. Modern drivers now curse those same cows centuries later while stuck in traffic. GPS systems practically short-circuit trying to make sense of the chaos. Bostonians just shrug and blame history for the confusion. Nobody wants to admit their city was basically designed by livestock with poor direction skills. 5. Ask someone in Boston to park the car, and you might hear something closer to pack the CIA. Dropping the letter R became a local trademark that confuses visitors instantly. Linguists trace it back to Old English speech patterns brought over by early settlers. Locals do not even notice they are doing it, since it feels completely normal to them. Tourists often try to imitate the accent and usually fail spectacularly. Bostonians find this endlessly amusing and rarely correct them. The accent has survived wars, technology, and generations, proving some habits refuse to disappear no matter what. 6. Dunkin' Donuts was born in 1950 just outside Boston in a town called Quincy, and it quickly became a regional obsession. What started as a simple donut shop turned into a full-blown identity for an entire state. Bostonians do not just drink coffee, they treat Dunkin' runs like a sacred morning ritual. Some locals joke they trust Dunkin' more than their own doctors. Drive-through lines wrap around blocks every single morning without fail. The brand grew so massive it eventually spread nationwide while still somehow feeling like it belongs only to Boston. 7. In 1876, inside a small Boston lab, Alexander Graham Bell made history with the very first telephone call. His famous words to his assistant were simple yet changed communication forever. Nobody in the building realized they were witnessing the birth of a technology revolution. Boston suddenly became the unlikely birthplace of instant long-distance conversation. Within decades, telephones spread across the entire country, connecting strangers everywhere. Bostonians still love reminding people their city practically invented modern gossip delivery. What began as a lab experiment eventually put a phone in every single American home. 8. Inside the Massachusetts State House hangs a large carved wooden fish nicknamed the Sacred Cod. And yes, it is treated with genuine reverence. Lawmakers have debated serious legislation for centuries, directly underneath this wooden fish staring down at them. In 1933, college pranksters actually stole the cod, causing a full-blown political panic. Police searched frantically until it was finally recovered and returned to its rightful place. The fish symbolizes Massachusetts' historic fishing industry and its importance to the colony's early economy. Even today, nobody dares mess with the cod without expecting real consequences. 9. Puritan settlers in Massachusetts once tried banning mince pies, claiming they were far too indulgent and suspiciously pagan. Officials feared these spiced meat pies encouraged gluttony and celebration, which clashed with their strict religious values. Bakers who defied the unofficial pressure risked disapproving stares from their entire community. Families still baked them quietly behind closed doors, refusing to give up flavor for piety. The pies eventually became a beloved holiday staple across America despite their rocky reputation. Turns out banning dessert has never actually worked on anyone throughout history. 10. John Hancock signed the Declaration of Independence with handwriting so large it practically demanded attention from across the room. Legend claims he wanted King George to read his name without needing glasses. His signature became so iconic that Americans still call any signature a John Hancock today. Fellow signers reportedly teased him for being dramatic with his enormous flourish. Hancock never denied enjoying the spotlight one bit. Centuries later, his name remains permanently linked to boldness, confidence, and a healthy dose of colonial swagger. 11. In 1919, the Boston Red Sox made a decision that would haunt them for generations by trading away Babe Ruth to the New York Yankees. Fans could not believe their star slugger was gone for nothing more than cash. What followed became known as the Curse of the Bambino, a legendary 86-year championship drought. Bostonians blamed everything from black cats to bad luck, refusing to accept simple bad management. Every heartbreaking loss somehow got tied back to that one trade. When the Sox finally won again in 2004, the entire city practically wept with relief. 12. The first shots of the Revolutionary War rang out in Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts back in 1775, and nobody fully agrees who fired first. Colonial militiamen faced off against British troops. In a tense standoff, nobody expected to explode into violence. Farmers grabbed muskets while church bells rang out, warning entire towns. Within hours, word spread across the countryside that war had truly begun. Paul Revere's midnight ride helped fuel the chaos and urgency. What started as a scattered skirmish on quiet farmland eventually launched an entire nation's fight for independence. 13. Before the Pilgrims even stepped off the Mayflower. In 1620, they huddled together and signed a document called the Mayflower Compact. Facing rough seas and uncertain leadership, they needed rules before chaos took over their tiny ship. 41 men agreed to govern themselves, fairly setting an early example of self-rule. Nobody expected this quick agreement to become a foundational piece of American democracy. Historians later called it one of the earliest governing documents in the colonies. A simple pact written out of necessity ended up shaping the future of an entire nation. 14. In 1641, Massachusetts became the first colony to formally legalize slavery through its Body of Liberties. Lawmakers buried the provision among other legal codes as though hoping nobody would notice its weight. This decision set a grim precedent that other colonies would soon follow. Enslaved people had no voice in a system built entirely without their consent. Generations later, Massachusetts would become a hub for abolitionist movements fighting against the very practice it once approved. History remembers both sides of that uncomfortable contradiction embedded deep within the state's origins. 15. In 1848, Boston opened the very first free municipal library in the entire United States, giving ordinary citizens access to knowledge without paying a cent. Wealthy donors and reformers believed education should not belong only to the rich. Long lines formed as residents eagerly checked out books for the very first time. Critics worried free access would encourage laziness instead of learning. Those fears quickly faded as literacy and curiosity spread through the city. The Boston Public Library became a national model proving that knowledge truly could belong to everyone. 16. Boston City Hall, completed in the 1960s, is routinely mocked as one of the ugliest buildings in all of America, yet somehow it remains a fiercely protected landmark. Its raw concrete brutalist design shocked residents who expected something more traditional. Locals compared it to everything from a parking garage to an alien spaceship. Despite decades of complaints, preservationists refused to let it be demolished. Architecture students still study its bold, controversial design today. Bostonians simply learned to live with their oddly beloved eyesore standing proudly in the middle of downtown. 17. Colonial Massachusetts passed strict laws punishing public drunkenness, yet somehow taverns became the beating heart of nearly every town's social life. Local officials preached sobriety while quietly holding town meetings inside those very same taverns. Ministers occasionally scolded rowdy patrons who ignored the rules entirely. Travelers relied on taverns for food shelter and the latest gossip passing through town. Business deals and political debates often happened over mugs of ale rather than in formal offices. The contradiction between strict laws and tavern culture never seemed to bother anyone for very long. 18. Paul Revere never actually shouted "The British are coming" during his famous midnight ride, and saying it aloud would have gotten him captured instantly. His mission depended entirely on secrecy, since British soldiers were listening for exactly that kind of warning. Instead, he quietly alerted colonial leaders town by town along his route. Riders used coded signals like lantern lights to avoid detection completely. The dramatic phrase was added later by storytellers eager for a catchier tale. Reality was far quieter than legend, yet somehow even more impressive once people understood the actual risk involved. 19. The Boston Marathon began in 1897, making it the oldest annual marathon anywhere in the world. And yes, runners back then had no idea what they were starting. Inspired by the modern Olympics, organizers wanted to test endurance across brutal terrain. Early runners battled hills mud and skeptical spectators who doubted anyone could finish. Heartbreak Hill earned its name by crushing runners' spirits mile after mile. Despite the suffering, thousands now travel from around the globe every year just to attempt it. What began as a small experiment turned into one of the most legendary races on Earth. 20. Faneuil Hall earned the nickname Cradle of Liberty thanks to the fiery pre-revolution town meetings held inside its walls. Colonists gathered there to debate taxation representation and eventually independence itself. Speeches grew so heated that arguments sometimes spilled out into the streets afterward. Merchants funded the building, never imagining it would become a hotbed of rebellion. Samuel Adams reportedly used the hall to rally support against British rule. Centuries later, it still stands as a symbol of protest, proving one building can shape an entire revolution's momentum. 21. Order a submarine sandwich in Boston, and locals might call it a spucky, leaving out-of-towners completely confused. The word likely came from Italian immigrant communities in the North End generations ago. Nobody outside New England seems to recognize the term at all. Sandwich shop workers use it so casually that tourists often assume it is a secret code. Old-timers proudly defend the word as authentic Boston vocabulary. Younger residents sometimes forget the term exists until a grandparent brings it up. Spucky remains one of those only in Boston quirks nobody bothered explaining to the rest of America. 22. Boston earned the nickname Beantown thanks to colonial cooks who slow-simmered beans in molasses for hours until they turned rich and sweet. Puritan households loved the dish partly because it could cook overnight without breaking strict Sabbath rules against working on Sundays. Sailors and traders eventually spread the dish along their travels, helping the nickname stick nationwide. Restaurants later leaned into the branding, selling baked beans as a tourist must-try. Some locals barely eat the dish anymore, yet the nickname refuses to fade. Turns out one slow-cooked pot of beans was enough to name an entire city. 23. Boston's Public Garden opened in 1837, becoming the very first public botanical garden anywhere in America, and residents did not quite know what to make of it. Wealthy donors wanted a peaceful escape from the noisy growing city surrounding it. Gardeners carefully planted rare flowers alongside winding walking paths meant purely for relaxation. Skeptics initially questioned why anyone needed a garden just for strolling around. Locals eventually fell in love with its calm atmosphere right in the middle of downtown chaos. Today, it remains one of the most photographed peaceful escapes hidden inside a busy American city. 24. Throughout the 1970s, windows kept violently falling out of Boston's brand new John Hancock Tower, terrifying pedestrians walking below. Engineers were baffled as massive glass panels randomly shattered and crashed onto the sidewalk. Plywood eventually covered dozens of empty window frames, earning the building an embarrassing nickname around the city. Investigators later discovered a flaw in the glass design that made panels unstable under stress. Every single pane in the building eventually had to be replaced at massive cost. What was meant to be a shining modern marvel briefly became Boston's most dangerous architectural punchline. 25. Boston originally sat on a tiny cramped peninsula called Shawmut back in 1630, barely large enough to hold its earliest settlers. Colonists quickly realized they needed more land to support a growing population. Over the following centuries, workers dumped massive amounts of dirt and gravel into the surrounding water, expanding the city dramatically. Entire neighborhoods like Back Bay now sit on land that used to be ocean. Locals often forget their favorite streets were once literally underwater. What began as a cramped little peninsula eventually tripled in size through sheer stubborn colonial ambition. 26. Colonial Massachusetts passed a law requiring any town with 50 or more families to fund a school teacher. And yes, some towns tried desperately to dodge the rule. Officials worried uneducated children would grow into an unruly, ungovernable population. Smaller towns sometimes shared a single traveling teacher just to technically follow the law. Parents who valued literacy pushed hard to keep schools funded despite tight colonial budgets. This early commitment to education helped shape Massachusetts into an academic powerhouse for centuries afterward. A stubborn little colonial law ended up planting the seeds for America's obsession with schooling. 27. Since 1952, the Beanpot Hockey Tournament has pitted 4 Boston area colleges against each other every single year without a single break. Boston University, Boston College. Harvard and Northeastern battle fiercely for bragging rights each winter. Fans pack arenas wearing school colors, ready to defend their team's honor at all costs. Rivalries run so deep that some friendships genuinely suffer during tournament week. Players treat the trophy like a championship, even though it is technically just a local college event. Decades later, the Beanpot remains one of Boston's proudest and most stubbornly consistent sports traditions. 28. The famous Bunker Hill Monument actually commemorates a battle that mostly happened on nearby Breed's Hill, instead leaving historians endlessly amused by the mix-up. Colonial militia dug fortifications overnight, preparing to face advancing British troops the next morning. Commanders reportedly told soldiers not to fire until they saw the whites of their enemies' eyes. Despite heavy losses, the battle proved colonial forces could stand against a powerful British army. Somehow, the wrong hill got credit and kept the name permanently. Centuries later, nobody has bothered correcting the label on America's most misnamed monument. 29. John Adams was born in Braintree, Massachusetts, and went on to become America's very first vice president before later serving as its second president. He famously described the vice presidency as the most insignificant office ever created by man or imagination. Adams often felt overshadowed, sitting quietly beside more celebrated founding fathers. Still, he pushed forward, eventually earning the presidency through sheer persistence and sharp political instincts. His Massachusetts roots shaped his stubborn, independent personality throughout his entire career. Turns out one unimpressed farmer's son from Braintree helped build an entire nation's government. 30. In January 1919, a massive steel tank in Boston's North End burst open, releasing a wave of molasses that surged through the streets at roughly 35 miles per hour. The thick, sticky flood destroyed buildings, crushed structures, and tragically killed 21 people caught in its path. Rescue workers struggled for days wading through knee-deep molasses searching for survivors. Horses got stuck completely helpless as the syrup hardened around them. Locals reportedly claimed they could smell molasses on hot summer days for decades afterward. What sounds like a silly disaster remains one of Boston's strangest and most tragic historical events. 31. Since 1877, the Swan boats in Boston's public garden have been powered entirely by pedaling humans hidden inside the boat with absolutely no motor involved. Robert Paget designed the boats, inspired by an opera featuring a swan-pulled knight. Families still line up every spring eager for a slow, gentle ride across the lagoon. Pedaling staff quietly work beneath painted swan shells while passengers barely notice the effort involved. Generations of children have grown up taking the exact same ride their grandparents once took. Somehow, a slow pedal-powered boat became one of Boston's most beloved unchanged traditions. 32. Beacon Hill still lights its historic streets using real gas-powered lamps that workers manually ignite by hand every single evening. Residents fought hard decades ago to preserve the flickering, old-fashioned glow instead of switching to modern electric lighting. Visitors often stop mid-walk just to watch the lamps come alive at dusk. Maintenance crews treat the antique lamps with surprising seriousness given how outdated the technology seems today. Neighbors take quiet pride in preserving something so stubbornly old-fashioned in the middle of a modern city. Beacon Hill simply refuses to let its colonial charm fade into electric convenience. 33. Just a short distance from Boston, the Salem witch hysteria of 1692 spiraled wildly out of control, ending with 20 people executed over little more than rumors and fear. Accusations spread rapidly through gossip, suspicion, and terrified neighbors turning against each other. Courts accepted flimsy spectral evidence that would never hold up under any real scrutiny. Innocent people faced execution simply because someone claimed to see their ghostly shape causing harm. The hysteria eventually collapsed once officials realized how reckless the trials had become. Centuries later, Salem still profits from tourists fascinated by its dark, chaotic history. 34. In 1621, Plymouth Colony held one of the earliest recorded Thanksgiving feasts in American history, bringing together pilgrims and Wampanoag guests for several days of shared food. Nobody at that gathering imagined turkey dinners would eventually become a nationwide obsession centuries later. The feast likely included venison, seafood, and local vegetables rather than the classic modern spread. Relations between settlers and native communities were far more complicated than the friendly story usually told. Still, that early gathering planted the seed for an entire national holiday. What began as a practical harvest meal became America's favorite excuse to overeat. 35. Boston fans have a well-earned reputation for booing even legendary players. And yes, that includes Hall of Famer Ted Williams during his very own playing career. Fans grew frustrated whenever Williams seemed distant or refused to tip his cap after home runs. Reporters constantly clashed with him, creating tension that spilled directly into the stands. Despite his incredible talent, some fans treated him with surprising harshness for years. Williams later admitted the criticism deeply affected him despite his tough exterior. Boston sports fans simply demand perfection and rarely hold back their brutally honest opinions. 36. Massachusetts drivers have earned themselves the infamous nickname Masshole, thanks to aggressive lane changes, sudden turns, and a general disregard for traffic patience. Rotary intersections confuse outsiders, while locals speed through them with fearless confidence. Horns blare constantly as drivers weave between lanes without warning or hesitation. Visitors often describe Boston traffic as controlled chaos rather than an actual organized system. Locals wear the nickname almost like a badge of honor rather than an insult. Somehow, reckless driving became such a defining trait that an entire regional stereotype grew directly out of it. 37. Completed in 1915, Boston's Custom House Tower became the city's very first skyscraper, towering dramatically over every other nearby building at the time. Officials had to bend strict height limit laws just to allow its tall clock tower design. Sailors reportedly used its illuminated clock face to navigate ships entering the harbor at night. Locals were stunned watching such a tall structure rise above their historically low skyline. The building eventually became a beloved downtown landmark rather than the controversial eyesore some initially feared. What started as a rule-breaking project became one of Boston's proudest architectural achievements. 38. Since opening in 1826, the Union Oyster House has proudly claimed the title of oldest continuously operating restaurant in the entire United States. Founding father Daniel Webster reportedly enjoyed downing oysters there, paired with generous glasses of brandy. The wooden booths and worn floors still carry that same colonial-era charm. Visitors expect walking through the door. Generations of families have eaten there without the restaurant ever fully closing its doors. Staff proudly share historical trivia with curious tourists eager for a taste of Old Boston. Few restaurants anywhere can claim such an unbroken, nearly 2-century-long streak of service. 39. Built in 1716, Boston Light became the very first lighthouse ever constructed in the American colonies, guiding ships safely toward the busy harbor. Keepers manually lit the beacon every single night regardless of brutal weather or freezing temperatures. British forces destroyed the lighthouse during the Revolutionary War, forcing colonists to rebuild it from scratch afterward. Sailors relied heavily on its steady glow to avoid dangerous rocky shorelines nearby. The lighthouse still operates today, making it one of the oldest continuously used maritime beacons in the entire country. A simple, stubborn light has guided ships safely for centuries straight. 40. Towering above Kenmore Square, the giant Citgo sign began as nothing more than a flashy gas company advertisement, yet somehow earned official protection as a genuine Boston landmark. City officials once tried removing it, sparking furious public backlash from residents who saw it as an unofficial city symbol. Red Sox fans use its glow beyond the Green Monster as an iconic backdrop during nighttime games. Preservationists eventually won the fight, keeping the sign lit permanently above the skyline. Few cities would fight this hard to protect a corporate gas advertisement. Boston clearly does not do sentimental attachment halfway. 41. Established in 1634, Boston Common holds the title of oldest public park in the entire United States, though its original purpose was far less peaceful than today's picnics. Colonists initially used the sprawling green space to graze cattle and sheep, rather than relax on blankets. Public hangings and militia drills also took place there, giving the park a much darker early history. Over time, the space slowly transformed into a beloved gathering spot for festivals, protests, and lazy afternoons. Modern visitors rarely imagine livestock once wandered where tourists now snap photos. Boston Common quietly carries centuries of contradiction beneath its peaceful green surface. 42. The Boston Massacre in 1770 killed only 5 colonists, yet somehow became one of the most effective propaganda tools in American Revolutionary history. A tense standoff between British soldiers and an angry crowd escalated quickly into gunfire nobody fully expected. Paul Revere later created a dramatic engraving exaggerating the violence to stir public outrage nationwide. Colonial newspapers spread the story, rapidly turning a chaotic street fight into a rallying cry against British tyranny. Few soldiers involved were ever severely punished, despite the public fury demanding justice. A small tragic skirmish helped light the fuse toward full-blown revolution. 43. Fenway Park's foul pole in right field carries the nickname Pesky's pole, named after Johnny Pesky, despite him barely ever hitting home runs during his career. Teammates jokingly gave him the honor after one memorable game-winning shot barely curved around that exact pole. The nickname stuck permanently, even though Pesky himself found the whole thing amusingly ironic. Fans now treat the pole like a sacred piece of Fenway folklore, rather than just metal and paint. Tourists often pose beside it, completely unaware of the joke behind its name. Sometimes baseball immortality comes from one lucky swing, rather than raw power. 44. Back in 1901, Boston passed one of America's earliest automobile speed limit laws, capping cars at a blistering 15 miles per hour on city streets. Early drivers grumbled loudly, insisting the limit made absolutely no sense for such an exciting new invention. Horse owners, meanwhile, welcomed the law, fearing reckless motorists would spook their animals in the streets. Police struggled to enforce the rule since few reliable ways existed yet to measure actual vehicle speed. Automobiles were still rare enough that most residents viewed them as noisy, dangerous novelties rather than everyday transportation. Boston's cautious little law hinted at chaos still to come. 45. The Massachusetts Bay Colony's 1630 Charter established early self-governing traditions that would later echo directly through the future United States Constitution. Colonists elected their own leaders and passed local laws long before anyone imagined a unified American nation. This early taste of self-rule made colonists especially resistant toward later British attempts at control. Town meetings became a direct training ground for democratic debate and decision-making. Generations later, founding fathers drew inspiration from these very same colonial governing habits. A humble 17th century charter quietly helped shape the entire structure of American democracy. 46. Boston's Dorchester neighborhood became home to the very first chocolate factory in America, way back in 1765, turning imported cacao beans into a booming colonial business. The Baker Chocolate Company eventually grew into a household name recognized across the entire country. Workers ground cacao, using water-powered mills along the Neponset River nearby. Colonists initially viewed chocolate more as a medicinal drink rather than the sugary treat people crave today. Demand steadily grew until chocolate became a staple indulgence in households nationwide. A quiet Boston neighborhood accidentally became the birthplace of America's sweetest addiction. 47. Boston hosted one of the earliest practical public demonstrations of telegraph technology, giving residents their first glimpse of instant long-distance communication. Crowds gathered curiously, watching messages transmit faster than any horse or ship could possibly deliver news. Skeptics initially doubted the strange clicking machine could genuinely replace traditional letters and messengers. Businessmen quickly recognized its incredible potential for faster trade and financial transactions. Within years, telegraph lines spread rapidly, connecting cities that once felt impossibly distant from each other. Boston's curious crowd had unknowingly witnessed the earliest sparks of the modern information age. 48. Boston's North End holds the title of oldest continuously inhabited neighborhood in the entire country, with residents living there since the earliest colonial days. Narrow, winding streets still reflect its original 17th century layout despite centuries of change around it. Italian immigrants later transformed the neighborhood, bringing bakeries, restaurants, and lively street festivals still beloved today. Paul Revere himself once lived there before his legendary midnight ride through the countryside. Modern visitors wander past centuries-old buildings while grabbing fresh cannoli from bustling local shops. Few neighborhoods anywhere blend colonial history and modern charm quite this seamlessly. 49. Harvard College was founded in 1636, making it older than the United States itself by a staggering 140 years before independence was even declared. Early students studied primarily theology, preparing to become ministers rather than lawyers or business leaders. Massachusetts colonists prioritized higher education remarkably early compared to other struggling colonies focused mainly on survival. Harvard slowly evolved over centuries into one of the most prestigious universities recognized worldwide today. Tourists now flood its historic campus completely unaware just how ancient the institution truly is. A tiny colonial school somehow outlived kings, empires, and the birth of an entire nation. 50. The old State House balcony once hosted the very first public reading of the Declaration of Independence in Massachusetts back in 1776, drawing massive, excited crowds below. Colonists gathered shoulder to shoulder, eager to hear the historic words declaring independence from British rule. Today, that same historic balcony sits awkwardly right above a busy modern subway entrance filled with commuters. Tourists often snap photos completely unaware they are standing above one of America's most historic buildings. Trains rumble beneath history nearly every single minute of the day. Boston somehow built modern convenience directly underneath centuries of revolutionary pride. 51. The old Boston Garden's parquet floor was famously uneven with warped boards and dead spots that opposing teams struggled to understand during games. Celtics players who practiced there daily learned exactly where the ball would bounce unpredictably while visitors stumbled through unfamiliar terrain. Some rivals openly complained the crooked floor gave Boston an unfair home court advantage nobody could officially prove. Legends like Larry Bird reportedly used the quirks to their strategic advantage during crucial moments. The arena eventually closed, but stories about that infamous warped floor still get retold today. Sometimes a few crooked boards can quietly help build a basketball dynasty. 52. Completed in 1877, Boston's Trinity Church quickly became recognized as one of the most architecturally significant buildings anywhere in America thanks to its bold Romanesque design. Architect Henry Hobson Richardson combined heavy stonework, dramatic towers, and rich, colorful interiors unlike anything Boston had seen before. Wealthy congregants funded the ambitious project, hoping to create a lasting spiritual landmark for the growing city. Visitors today still crane their necks admiring its intricate stained glass and carved details. Architecture students travel from around the world specifically to study its influential design. A single church quietly reshaped how American buildings were imagined afterward. 53. Long before the term spread nationwide, New Englanders, including Bostonians, were already known as the original Yankees, decades before baseball ever borrowed the name. The term likely originated from Dutch settlers, using it somewhat mockingly toward English colonists nearby. Over time, Americans reclaimed the word, turning it into a proud symbol rather than an insult. British soldiers during the Revolutionary War used it dismissively before colonial troops flipped its meaning entirely. Eventually, the word spread far beyond New England, attaching itself to everything from soldiers to sports teams. Boston quietly holds bragging rights as the true original Yankee homeland. 54. Clam chowder is so deeply tied to Boston's identity that Maine once floated a serious bill attempting to ban tomatoes from anything labeled New England-style chowder. Lawmakers treated the debate with surprising seriousness, as if protecting sacred culinary tradition from outside corruption. Purists insisted a creamy base was the only acceptable version, while rebels defended their tomato-based Manhattan-style alternative. Restaurants nervously watched the political drama unfold, wondering if their menus might face legal consequences. The bill ultimately failed, but the rivalry between chowder styles never fully faded away. Few foods anywhere inspire this much regional stubbornness and passionate legislative outrage. 55. In 2004, Massachusetts made history by becoming the very first state in the entire country to legally recognize same-sex marriage after a landmark court ruling. Couples lined up outside city halls at midnight, eager to be among the first legally married nationwide. Supporters celebrated with tears while opponents warned the decision would bring chaos nobody could quite explain. Other states watched closely, wondering whether similar rulings might eventually follow across the country. Massachusetts stood firm despite intense national scrutiny and heated political debate. What began as one bold state decision eventually reshaped marriage laws across all of America. 56. The stunning Emerald Necklace Park system, winding through Boston, was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, the very same architect behind New York's famous Central Park. Olmsted envisioned connected green spaces allowing residents to escape crowded city streets without ever needing to leave town. Construction stretched across decades, blending marshland parks and winding waterways into one continuous scenic chain. Critics initially doubted such an ambitious project could ever be completed successfully. Today, joggers, cyclists, and families enjoy the peaceful green corridor daily without realizing its complex origin story. Boston essentially got its own miniature Central Park stretched across an entire city. 57. Back in 1912, Massachusetts passed America's very first minimum wage law, specifically protecting women and children working long hours in dangerous factory conditions. Reformers had grown horrified watching exhausted workers endure grueling shifts for painfully low pay. Factory owners loudly protested, claiming the new law would destroy their already thin profit margins entirely. Supporters argued basic fairness mattered more than uninterrupted corporate convenience and endless exploitation. The law eventually inspired similar protections adopted across other states nationwide. A single stubborn Massachusetts law quietly helped launch America's long fight toward fairer workplace standards. 58. Docked proudly in Boston Harbor, the USS Constitution remains an active-duty Navy ship, making it the oldest floating commissioned warship still afloat anywhere on Earth. Sailors continue performing official ceremonial duties aboard, despite the ship being built all the way back in 1797. Nicknamed Old Ironsides after cannonballs reportedly bounced harmlessly off its thick wooden hull during battle. Tourists tour its historic decks completely unaware they are technically stepping aboard active military property. The Navy proudly maintains the ship rather than retiring it purely for sentimental historical reasons. Few warships anywhere manage to stay technically employed after more than 2 centuries. 59. The Boston Celtics have claimed more NBA championships than any other franchise throughout the entire history of professional basketball, establishing a dynasty few teams could ever match. Legendary players like Bill Russell helped build a winning culture that intimidated rival teams for decades straight. Banners hanging from the rafters practically cover every inch of available ceiling space inside their arena. Rival fans often joke that counting Boston's championships alone takes longer than watching an actual game. Younger generations of players still get reminded constantly about the franchise's legendary expectations. Winning basically became less of a goal and more of a stubborn Boston tradition. 60. Built in 1710, Boston's Long Wharf once stretched an impressive half-mile directly into the harbor, making it one of colonial America's longest and busiest docking structures. Ships loaded with goods from around the world lined up eagerly, waiting for available space to unload their cargo. Merchants built warehouses directly along the wharf, hoping to speed up trade and maximize profits. Sailors, fresh off long voyages, often stumbled straight into nearby taverns before even reaching dry land properly. The bustling wharf helped transform Boston into a major international trading hub rather than a small colonial outpost. A single ambitious dock quietly fueled an entire city's economic rise. 61. Founded in 1881, the Boston Symphony Orchestra quickly became recognized as one of the oldest continuously performing orchestras anywhere in the entire country, attracting talented musicians from around the world. Wealthy philanthropist Henry Lee Higginson funded the ambitious project, hoping to give Boston world-class cultural credibility. Early performances drew skeptical crowds, unsure whether the city could truly support such an ambitious musical venture. Talent and dedication quickly silenced any doubts among stubborn local critics. Symphony Hall eventually became renowned worldwide for its remarkably precise acoustics, admired by musicians everywhere. A single philanthropist's dream turned into one of America's most respected musical institutions. 62. Despite its misleading name, Boston cream pie is not actually a pie at all, but rather a cake invented at a Boston hotel back in the 1850s. Chef Monsieur Sanzian created the dessert by layering sponge cake with rich custard filling before topping it with glossy chocolate glaze. Confused bakers nationwide eventually adopted the odd naming convention without ever questioning its accuracy. Massachusetts officially declared it the state dessert decades later, cementing its beloved status permanently. Visitors ordering it often expect flaky crust only to receive soft cake instead. Sometimes the tastiest desserts come wrapped in the most confusing names imaginable. 63. Completed during the 1990s, the massive cleanup of Boston Harbor became one of the largest and most expensive urban environmental restoration projects in American history. Decades of pollution had turned the once thriving harbor into something locals bitterly nicknamed one of the dirtiest waterways in the entire country. Engineers built enormous new treatment facilities designed to filter waste before it ever reached open water again. Environmentalists celebrated cautiously while taxpayers grumbled loudly about the staggering costs involved. Fish and marine life gradually returned, proving the massive investment eventually paid off. Boston essentially spent a fortune convincing its own harbor to stop smelling terrible. 64. Boston's Freedom Trail is literally nothing more than a painted red line stretched across sidewalks connecting 16 historic sites scattered throughout the entire city. Tourists follow the simple stripe like breadcrumbs, leading them past churches, graveyards, and revolutionary landmarks without needing a map. City officials created the trail decades ago, hoping to simplify navigation for confused history-hungry visitors. Locals occasionally step over the painted line without realizing millions of tourists treat it like sacred ground. guides walking backward along the trail have somehow mastered avoiding collisions with distracted photo-taking crowds. Sometimes the simplest idea, a painted line, becomes a city's most beloved historical attraction. 65. The very first American novel written by a native-born colonist rolled off a humble Boston printing press long before anyone imagined American literature becoming its own respected tradition. Early colonial readers were far more accustomed to religious sermons and educational pamphlets than fictional storytelling. Critics at the time worried novels might corrupt impressionable minds with dangerous, frivolous entertainment. Despite the skepticism, curious readers quietly devoured the new format anyway. That small printing press moment quietly planted seeds for America's massive future literary industry. A stubborn little colonial printer accidentally helped launch an entire nation's storytelling tradition. 66. Massachusetts pioneered the New England tradition of town meetings, allowing ordinary residents to directly debate and vote on local issues without relying entirely on distant elected officials. Colonists gathered inside crowded meeting houses, passionately arguing over taxes, roads, and community rules. This hands-on democratic tradition gave regular citizens genuine influence long before most nations even considered such direct participation. Some meetings reportedly grew so heated that neighbors stopped speaking afterward over petty disagreements. Remarkably, many small Massachusetts towns still practice this exact same direct democracy tradition today. A stubborn colonial habit somehow survived centuries without ever losing its argumentative charm. 67. In Boston, rooting loudly for a rival sports team inside the wrong neighborhood bar has genuinely gotten people politely but firmly asked to leave the premises. Local sports loyalty runs so deep that bartenders sometimes treat rival jerseys like an open provocation. Yankees fans especially learn quickly that Red Sox territory shows absolutely zero tolerance for divided loyalty. Friendly ribbing can escalate surprisingly fast once alcohol and playoff tension mix together. Regulars often warn newcomers beforehand, hoping to avoid unnecessary awkward confrontations. Boston sports passion apparently comes with strict, unofficial rules nobody bothers writing down anywhere. 68. Opened in 1897, Boston's subway system became the very first subway ever built anywhere in the entire United States, predating similar systems in much larger cities. Engineers faced skeptical residents who doubted underground trains could possibly work safely beneath a crowded city. Construction crews dug tunnels by hand, facing constant flooding and unstable ground conditions throughout the entire project. Opening day crowds gathered nervously curious to witness trains disappearing beneath the streets for the very first time. Skepticism quickly faded once residents realized just how much faster their commutes suddenly became. A cautious experimental tunnel accidentally launched America's entire underground transportation revolution. 69. Ordering a regular coffee in Boston does not mean plain black coffee, like most visitors mistakenly assume walking into any local shop for the first time. Locally regular automatically means coffee loaded with both cream and sugar, without needing to specify anything further. Confused tourists often receive a sweetened drink they never actually intended to order. Coffee shop workers barely blink twice since the local terminology feels completely obvious to them. Newcomers quickly learn to clarify their order carefully after one unexpectedly sugary surprise. Boston apparently decided plain coffee simply was not worth having its own dedicated word. 70. Meant to bury Boston's busy highway underground, the massive construction project known as the Big Dig eventually became the most expensive highway project in American history. Original cost estimates ballooned wildly as engineers battled unexpected underground obstacles and constant design changes. Traffic nightmares plagued the city for over a decade, while construction crews worked practically non-stop. Leaks, structural problems, and safety concerns occasionally made headlines long after completion. Despite the chaos, the finished tunnel eventually transformed Boston's congested waterfront into usable public space. Sometimes fixing traffic apparently requires bulldozing an entire city's patience first. 71. Massachusetts proudly hosted the very first printing press, established anywhere in the American colonies back in 1638, giving colonists their earliest ability to produce local printed material. Early presses mainly published religious texts, psalm books, and official government documents rather than entertaining literature. Skilled printers were scarce, forcing colonies to rely heavily on this single operation for years. That humble press eventually helped spread news pamphlets and revolutionary ideas throughout the colonies decades later. Without it, colonial communication would have remained painfully slow and heavily dependent on handwritten letters. A single stubborn printing press quietly helped shape America's earliest information network. So there you have it, 71 reasons Boston somehow makes perfect sense once you have had a Dunkin in hand. Which one of these caught you completely off guard? Drop it in the comments and let us know. And if you love learning the weirdest, craziest facts about the places you thought you knew, hit subscribe right now here on Dumbest Things, because we are just getting started. See you in the next one.